What if the oldest light in the sky is not merely a photograph of our universe as an infant, but a faint screen through which something even older is trying to appear? Imagine that before our familiar cosmos expanded, cooled, and filled with stars, another cosmic age had already unfolded. Perhaps it ended in collapse, faded into emptiness, or transformed into the beginning we call the Big Bang. Could any trace of that earlier reality have survived the transition? Could ancient light carry a scar, a pattern, or a quiet memory from a universe before ours? Before we begin, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening tonight? To approach this question, we first need to understand what astronomers mean when they speak of ancient light. When you look at the moon, you see it as it was a little more than 1 second ago, because moonlight takes time to cross the distance to Earth. The sun appears roughly 8 minutes in the past. Nearby stars are seen years or decades ago, while distant galaxies may appear as they existed billions of years before human beings emerged. A telescope is therefore more than a device for seeing far away. It is a machine for looking backward through time. The deeper into space we observe, the earlier the chapter of cosmic history we are allowed to read. Yet there is a limit to this backward view. Even the most powerful optical telescope cannot see ordinary light from the first moments after the Big Bang. The early universe was not a clear, dark space through which light could travel freely. It was an intensely hot and dense plasma, filled with electrically charged particles. Photon. The particles of light repeatedly collided with free electrons. Instead of travelling in straight lines across vast distances, they scattered constantly, like beams of light trapped inside a thick, glowing fog. The universe was bright, but it was not transparent. No clear image could move through it, because every photon was quickly interrupted and redirected. This cosmic fog lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. During that time, space continued to expand, and expansion allowed the universe to cool. Eventually, around 380,000 years after the beginning of the hot Big Bang phase, conditions became cool enough for electrons to join with atomic nuclei, mainly protons, forming neutral hydrogen atoms, with far fewer free electrons available to scatter them. Photons could suddenly travel much more freely. Light that had been trapped in the cosmic plasma began streaming across the universe. That ancient radiation has continued travelling ever since, stretched by cosmic expansion into much longer wavelengths. Today, we detect it as the cosmic microwave background. The cosmic microwave background, often shortened to the CMB, surrounds us in every direction. It is not coming from one object or one distant place. Wherever we look deeply enough, we encounter this ancient afterglow. It forms a nearly uniform background behind the galaxies. Stars, planets, and clouds of gas that appeared later. Its present temperature is only about 7 degrees above absolute zero, making it extremely cold by everyday standards. Yet it began as far more energetic radiation in a much hotter universe. Over billions of years, the expansion of space stretched its wavelengths and reduced its energy, transforming a brilliant early glow into faint microwaves that modern instruments can measure. Calling the CMB the oldest light we can see is accurate, but it can also be slightly misleading. It does not come from the instant when the universe began. It comes from the moment when the universe first became transparent to electromagnetic radiation. There may have been an enormous stretch of cosmic history before that light was released, even if the duration seems short compared with the universe's present age. The CMB is therefore more like the surface of a cloud than a view of what lies behind it. We see the last scattering of photons, just as we see sunlight leaving the visible surface of the sun rather than its deep interior. This surface is sometimes called the last scattering surface. It is not a physical shell centered around Earth. Rather, It is the boundary in time from which the ancient photons reaching us today were released. An observer in another galaxy would also see a cosmic microwave background surrounding them, formed from a different region of the early universe. Every observer occupies the center of their own visible sphere, not because they hold a special place in the cosmos, but because light reaches each location from all directions. This can feel strange at first, yet it follows naturally from the finite speed of light and the immense age of the universe. At first glance, the cosmic microwave background appears almost perfectly smooth. Its temperature is nearly the same across the entire sky. This remarkable uniformity tells us that the early universe was hot, dense, and astonishingly similar from one region to another. But when astronomers measure the CMB with great precision, tiny variations emerge. Some areas are slightly warmer, while others are slightly cooler, with differences of only a few parts in 100,000. These faint irregularities are not imperfections in the data. They are among the most valuable pieces of evidence in modern cosmology, because they reveal the seeds from which all later cosmic structure grew. Regions that were slightly denser than average exerted a little more gravitational attraction over immense periods. They drew in additional matter. Tiny differences became larger differences. Gradually, dark matter formed gravitational frameworks. Ordinary gas fell into them, and the first stars and galaxies began to appear. Galaxy clusters, vast filaments, and enormous cosmic voids can all be traced back, in principle, to the delicate patterns visible in the microwave sky. The CMB is therefore not merely an old photograph. It is a map of the initial conditions that shape nearly everything we see around us, including the galaxy in which the Sun and Earth would eventually form. The patterns in this map are highly structured. Cosmologists study the sizes, strengths, and statistical distribution of temperature variations across the sky. They also measure polarization, a subtle orientation in the oscillation of the radiation. These observations can reveal information about the universe's geometry, composition, expansion history, and early physical processes. From the CMB, scientists have inferred that ordinary matter makes up only a small fraction of the cosmic energy budget. While dark matter and dark energy dominate the larger picture, the background also supports the idea that space is very close to geometrically flat on the largest observable scales. Although measurements always carry limits and uncertainties, the extraordinary success of these measurements can create the impression that the earliest universe is already well understood. In reality, the CMB gives us a detailed view of a particular boundary, while leaving the deeper origin of those patterns uncertain. We can observe the ripples, but questions remain about what produced them. The leading framework says that they began as microscopic quantum fluctuations during an extremely early period of rapid expansion known as cosmic inflation. Inflation may have stretched these fluctuations to astronomical scales, where they later became the density variations seen in the microwave background. This idea explains many observations elegantly, but the underlying mechanism has not yet been directly established. Inflation itself does not automatically tell us whether there was a universe before ours. In some models, inflation begins after a prior phase. In others, it may continue eternally in some regions, producing many expanding cosmic domains. There are also proposals in which the hot Big Bang emerged from a bounce following an earlier contraction. Another possibility is that the universe passed through a previous state that looked nothing like ordinary space and time. These ideas differ greatly, and none has been confirmed. Still, they share a central hope. If a pre-Big Bang phase existed, perhaps it influenced the conditions from which our observable universe developed. For any previous universe to reveal itself through ancient light, information would somehow need to survive. This is not simple. The early universe was violent, hot, rapidly changing, and possibly dominated by processes that could erase earlier structure. Inflation, if it occurred, may have stretched space so dramatically that most pre-existing details were diluted beyond recognition. Imagine drawing a small symbol on a rubber sheet and then stretching the sheet until the symbol becomes wider than any observable region. The pattern has not necessarily vanished in a mathematical sense, but no local observer can reconstruct it. Much of the past may have been pushed permanently beyond our cosmic horizon, yet erasure may not be complete in every model. Certain large-scale features might survive if they were strong enough. If inflation lasted only the minimum required duration, or if the transition between cosmic phases preserved particular forms of information, such remnants could potentially influence temperature patterns, polarization, gravitational waves, or the overall distribution of matter. Scientists sometimes describe these hypothetical effects as relics or signatures. The word signature, however, should be treated carefully. A strange pattern is not automatically evidence of an earlier universe. Nature produces random variations. Instruments introduce imperfections. And our own galaxy adds foreground signals that must be separated from the ancient background. The microwave sky has already presented a few intriguing features. One side of the sky appears slightly different from the other in certain statistical analyses. There is also a large region commonly called the cold spot, which is cooler than its surroundings across a broad area. Other studies have examined unusual alignments among large-scale patterns. These observations have inspired speculation about exotic early universe events, including possible interactions with other cosmic regions. But none of these anomalies has been accepted as evidence of a universe before ours. They may reflect chance, imperfect foreground removal, subtle measurement effects, or incomplete understanding of ordinary cosmic structures. This distinction between an interesting anomaly and a genuine discovery is essential. When scientists examine an enormous dataset, some unusual features will appear naturally. Even if the underlying process is random, consider tossing a coin thousands of times. A long sequence of heads might look meaningful, but with enough tosses, unlikely runs eventually occur. The cosmic microwave background contains millions of measurable regions and many possible statistical tests. If researchers search in enough ways, they will find patterns that seem surprising. The challenge is to predict a feature in advance, measure it independently, and show that ordinary explanations are unlikely to produce it. A convincing trace of an earlier universe would therefore need to be more than a single strange patch. Ideally, a theoretical model would predict a specific, measurable pattern before researchers search for it. That pattern might then appear consistently in temperature data, polarization data, and perhaps other cosmic messengers. Independent instruments would need to detect the same effect. Foreground emissions from dust, gas, and galaxies would have to be ruled out. Alternative explanations within standard cosmology would need to fail. Only after such careful testing could scientists begin to speak seriously about evidence from before the hot Big Bang. The phrase ancient light also carries another difficulty. Light itself may not be capable of crossing the deepest boundary in cosmic history. The CMB photons were released long after the earliest known physical processes, and any electromagnetic radiation from before that time would have been repeatedly scattered and thermalized. Thermalization means that radiation loses much of its original identity and becomes part of a general heat distribution. A photon carrying information from an earlier era might be absorbed, re-emitted, and mixed with countless others until its individual history became impossible to recover. What survives may not be a direct image, but only an indirect influence on later patterns. This is why cosmologists often search not for older photons, but for older imprints. The distinction is subtle and important. The microwave photons arriving at our detectors probably did not travel intact from a previous universe. Instead, conditions before the CMB formed may have shaped the density, motion, or geometry of the early plasma. Those conditions could then alter the light released at last scattering. In this sense, The CMB would function like the surface of a pond, whose ripples reveal an unseen disturbance beneath the water. We may not observe the original event directly, but its influence could remain encoded in the motion of something we can observe. Even this possibility depends on whether the universe had a meaningful before. In ordinary language, before means an earlier moment on a continuous timeline, but near the Big Bang, time itself may behave differently from our everyday intuition. General relativity describes space and time as part of a single dynamic structure. When the equations are extended backward under simple conditions, density and curvature increase until the theory reaches a singularity, a point where its predictions fail. This does not necessarily mean that nature truly contained an infinitely dense point. It may mean only that general relativity is incomplete in that extreme regime and must be replaced by a theory of quantum gravity. Without a complete theory of quantum gravity, we do not know whether time began, bounced, branched, emerged, or changed its meaning at the earliest boundary. Asking what came before the Big Bang may be like asking what lies north of the North Pole in some models, because the direction itself may cease to exist. In other models, however, the question is perfectly sensible because time continues through a transition. Scientific uncertainty here is not a weakness or an invitation to invent any answer we prefer. It is a precise recognition that our best theories are powerful within their tested domains, but become unreliable when pushed into conditions far beyond direct experimental reach. For now, the cosmic microwave background remains our clearest electromagnetic window into the early universe. It has revealed a cosmos that began in an extraordinarily smooth state, yet contained the tiny variations needed to build complexity. It has confirmed many aspects of the hot Big Bang model and helped transform cosmology into a precision science. At the same time, it stands like a softly glowing curtain across the past. We can study its texture, measure its temperature, and trace the faint ripples spread across it. But whether those ripples were born entirely within our universe, or inherited something from an earlier cosmic chapter, remains unknown. As you imagine that curtain surrounding us in every direction, remember that the light entering our instruments tonight began its journey before stars, planets, oceans, or living cells existed. It crossed expanding space for nearly the entire age of the observable universe before being collected by antennas and converted into maps. Within those maps may be only the simple beginnings of our own cosmos, or, hidden beneath layers of random variation and physical transformation, there may be some subtle inheritance from a deeper past. To search for it, we must now move beyond the moment when light first travelled freely and enter the opaque universe that existed before the oldest visible glow. To move beyond the oldest visible light, we must imagine a universe in which seeing was not yet possible. The space around us today is mostly transparent, allowing photons to cross billions of light years with relatively few interruptions. But the early cosmos was more like the interior of a star, brilliant, dense, and opaque. Light existed everywhere, yet it could not carry a clear picture across any meaningful distance. Every photon was surrounded by charged particles and repeatedly scattered before it could escape. The cosmic microwave background marks the moment this fog finally lifted. Everything earlier lies behind that glowing boundary, hidden not by darkness, but by an overwhelming abundance of light and matter interacting too closely for any image to survive. If you could somehow enter the universe during its first few 100,000 years, you would not find galaxies, stars, planets, or empty black space. You would encounter an almost uniform ocean of hot plasma expanding in every direction. Atomic nuclei moved among free electrons, while photons constantly struck those electrons and changed course. The temperature was thousands of degrees even near the end of this era, and far higher at earlier times. There was no single center from which matter was flying outward. Expansion was occurring everywhere, increasing the distance between regions of space. Any observer embedded in that plasma would see the surrounding material receding, just as observers in distant galaxies today see large-scale expansion around themselves. The reason light could not travel freely is connected to electric charge. Electrons interact strongly with electromagnetic radiation. So, a photon moving through a dense sea of free electrons rarely continues undisturbed. It is scattered again and again, surrendering any simple information about where it originally came from. The same principle can be seen in ordinary fog, where droplets scatter visible light and conceal distant objects. Yet the early universe was far more extreme. It was not a dark landscape covered by mist. The fog itself was glowing, and radiation filled every region. A photon's path resembled a random walk, changing direction repeatedly rather than crossing space along a clean, straight line. The cosmos possessed light, but not vision. As the universe expanded, its temperature steadily declined. Expansion does not merely spread matter over a larger volume, it also stretches the wavelengths of radiation and reduces the average energy of particles. Eventually, the plasma cooled enough for positively charged nuclei to capture electrons. This transition is called recombination, although the name is historically misleading because electrons and nuclei were combining for the first time. Once neutral atoms formed, the number of free electrons dropped dramatically. Photons could then travel much greater distances without scattering. The universe became transparent, and the radiation released during this transition began the long journey that brings it to our microwave detectors today. Because the earlier plasma destroyed directional information, ordinary electromagnetic observations cannot simply penetrate beyond the last scattering surface. Building a more powerful telescope does not solve the problem. The obstacle is not that the earlier light is too faint or too distant. The information itself was mixed and repeatedly redistributed. It is similar to trying to identify the shape of a candle by examining the uniform warmth left after its flame has heated an entire room. The energy remains, but the original image has been lost. To explore earlier times, cosmologists must therefore search for indirect evidence or use messengers that interacted less strongly with the primordial plasma. One such messenger may be the neutrino. Neutrinos are extraordinarily light, elementary particles that interact only weakly with ordinary matter. Trillions pass through your body every second, most without striking a single atom. In the early universe, neutrinos were initially trapped in frequent interactions, but they began traveling freely when the cosmos was only about 1 second old, much earlier than the release of the microwave background. In principle, the universe should still be filled with a cosmic neutrino background, an ancient counterpart to the CMB. Detecting it directly would open a window into a much earlier age. Although these primordial neutrinos now possess extremely low energies and are extraordinarily difficult to measure, scientists have not yet produced a direct image of this neutrino background, but its influence can be inferred indirectly. Primordial neutrinos affected the expansion of the universe and the development of density fluctuations, leaving subtle signatures in the cosmic microwave background and in the distribution of galaxies. These effects are consistent with the expected existence of relic neutrinos, giving strong support to the standard early universe picture. Yet even a successful direct detection would not necessarily reveal a universe before ours. It would move our observational boundary much closer to the hot Big Bang, allowing us to test conditions at an age of seconds rather than hundreds of thousands of years. That would still be a profound expansion of cosmic memory. An even deeper messenger may be gravity itself. Gravitational waves are ripples in the geometry of space-time, produced when masses or energy distributions change in an asymmetric way. Modern observatories have detected gravitational waves from colliding black holes and neutron stars, confirming that these ripples can cross the universe while preserving information about distant events. Unlike photons, gravitational waves interact extremely weakly with matter. A primordial gravitational wave could travel through the dense early plasma almost without being scattered. If such waves were generated during inflation, a cosmic bounce, or another process near the beginning. They might carry evidence from an era unreachable by electromagnetic light. The difficulty is that ancient gravitational waves would be faint and spread across a vast range of frequencies. Different instruments search for different portions of this hidden background. Ground-based detectors listen for relatively rapid oscillations, while pulsar timing arrays use extremely regular signals from spinning neutron stars to probe much slower waves. Proposed space-based observatories would explore frequencies between these ranges. The cosmic microwave background itself offers another method. Primordial gravitational waves could have left a distinctive swirling pattern in its polarization. This pattern is known as B-mode polarization, although other effects, including gravitational lensing and galactic dust, can create B-modes as well. Separating the primordial signal requires exceptional precision. A confirmed primordial gravitational wave background would be one of the most important discoveries in cosmology. It could reveal the energy scale and dynamics of extremely early cosmic processes, yet interpretation would remain careful and model-dependent. A signal might support certain forms of inflation, but it would not automatically prove that the universe began with inflation or that no earlier phase existed. Alternatively, some bouncing or cyclic models may also generate gravitational waves, with patterns that differ in their frequency distribution or statistical properties. Scientists would need to compare detailed predictions rather than attach a dramatic explanation to the first unexplained signal. The same evidence can sometimes fit several theories until additional measurements break the tie. To understand how these earlier signatures might form, it helps to travel conceptually closer to the hot Big Bang. By the time the universe was a few minutes old, it had cooled enough for protons and neutrons to combine into light atomic nuclei. This period, called Big Bang nucleosynthesis, produced most of the cosmos's primordial hydrogen and helium, along with small amounts of deuterium and lithium. Measurements of these elements provide another kind of ancient record. Their abundances depend on the temperature, density, expansion rate, and particle content of the early universe. They do not form a picture, but they function like chemical fossils, preserving information from a time long before the microwave background was released. The agreement between predicted and observed abundances is one of the strongest supports for the hot Big Bang model. Still, some tensions remain, particularly involving lithium, whose measured primordial abundance is lower than simple theoretical predictions. This lithium problem may arise from stellar processes, observational challenges, or physics not yet fully understood. It is an example of how cosmic relics can reveal both the success and the incompleteness of our models. Even so, nucleosynthesis reaches only back to the first minutes. Before that, the universe passed through transformations involving particle species, matter and antimatter, and perhaps unknown fields. Each transition may have erased some information while preserving other traces. At still earlier times, the cosmos was so hot that familiar particles behaved very differently. Protons and neutrons could not remain intact, and their constituent quarks moved within an energetic plasma. At higher energies, the electromagnetic and weak nuclear forces may have acted as aspects of a more unified interaction. The exact behavior of nature under these conditions is partly tested through particle accelerators, but cosmic temperatures once exceeded anything humans can reproduce. As we move backward, our knowledge depends increasingly on extrapolating well-tested theories beyond current experiments. These extrapolations are informed and mathematical, yet they carry growing uncertainty. The farther we travel toward the beginning, the less direct evidence guides us. Eventually, we approach the proposed period of cosmic inflation. In its simplest description, inflation was a brief era when space expanded at an extraordinary accelerating rate. Regions smaller than subatomic scales may have been stretched to dimensions far larger than the observable universe. This expansion could explain why the microwave sky is so uniform. why space appears nearly flat, and why unwanted relics predicted by some particle theories are not abundant. Quantum fluctuations present during inflation may also have been stretched into the initial variations that later formed galaxies. These successes make inflation a leading framework, but they do not identify the precise field or mechanism responsible, and many versions of inflation remain possible. Inflation creates a peculiar barrier to knowledge. If it lasted sufficiently long, almost every trace of earlier conditions would have been stretched far beyond the region we can observe. Matter, radiation, curvature, and irregularities from a preceding phase could become so diluted that the observable universe would appear newly prepared, smooth and nearly empty except for quantum fluctuations generated during inflation itself. In that case, the ancient sky might tell us much about inflation, but almost nothing about what preceded it. The process would act as a cosmic reset, not necessarily destroying information everywhere, but removing it from our accessible horizon. A previous universe could have existed without leaving any detectable mark in our region. However, inflation may not erase absolutely everything. Its ability to hide the past depends on how it began, how long it lasted, and what structures existed beforehand. If the duration were only slightly longer than the minimum needed to explain present observations, some large-scale relics might remain near the edges of detectability. A pre-inflationary disturbance could influence the broadest patterns in the CMB, where statistical measurements are least precise because we have only one observable sky. Certain models predict suppressed fluctuations, unusual correlations, or departures from simple randomness on the largest scales. None of these features has yet provided convincing evidence, but they guide researchers toward observations that might distinguish among competing histories. There is also a deeper question. Can inflation itself be extended infinitely into the past? Some theoretical results suggest that space-time's expanding sufficiently rapidly cannot be complete in the past under broad assumptions. This does not prove that the universe emerged from nothing, nor does it identify what came before inflation. It indicates that inflation alone may not provide a complete description of the earliest boundary. A prior quantum phase, a bounce, a beginning of time, or some other unknown structure may still be required. The mathematics tells us where a theory becomes incomplete, but not automatically what replaces it. At that frontier, cosmology meets the unresolved problem of quantum gravity. General relativity describes gravity as the curvature of spacetime and has passed many demanding tests. Quantum theory describes particles and fields with astonishing accuracy. Yet these two frameworks are not fully reconciled in extreme situations where immense density and tiny length scales occur together. Near the traditional Big Bang singularity, both are needed. General relativity predicts its own breakdown, while ordinary quantum field theory assumes a space-time background that may itself be violently fluctuating. Proposed approaches include string theory, loop quantum gravity, causal set models, and other ideas, but no experimentally confirmed theory yet provides a complete account of the cosmic beginning. This uncertainty changes the meaning of ancient evidence. We often imagine searching for a photograph from before the Big Bang, as though the universe were a sequence of rooms separated by a door. But the transition may have altered space, time, matter, and causality so deeply that ordinary images could never cross it. What survives might instead be a probability distribution, a geometric pattern, a spectrum of gravitational waves, or a constraint on the allowed conditions of our universe. The evidence may be abstract rather than visual. Reading it would require combining cosmological observations with particle physics, mathematics, and theories of space-time at their most fundamental level. For now, the opaque early universe remains both a barrier and a guide. It prevents ordinary light from showing us the first hundreds of thousands of years directly, yet it encourages us to search for messengers that travel differently. Neutrinos may carry memories from the first second. Element abundances preserve conditions from the first minutes. Gravitational waves could reach us from far earlier, perhaps from inflation or a phase before it. The microwave background records the later imprint of primordial processes. Each is a separate page, written in a different physical language, and none can yet tell the entire story alone. As we drift backward through these layers, the familiar idea of a single visible beginning begins to dissolve. The oldest light is not the start of the universe, only the earliest electromagnetic surface we can currently observe. Behind it lies a long, hidden passage through plasma, nuclear reactions, particle transformations, and perhaps inflation. Beyond that may stand a boundary where our equations lose their certainty. To ask whether another universe existed before ours, we must next examine what the Big Bang theory truly claims. It describes an ancient, hot, dense expansion with extraordinary success. But whether it describes the absolute beginning of everything is a far more delicate question. The phrase "the Big Bang" often creates a vivid picture, a single point exploding into empty space, producing matter, light, and time in one sudden event. But this familiar image is not what modern cosmology actually describes. The Big Bang was not an explosion occurring at one location inside a larger universe. It was the expansion of space itself, happening everywhere at once. Every sufficiently distant region was once much closer to every other region, and as the universe evolved, the distances between those regions increased. The theory describes a cosmos that was hotter, denser, and more uniform in the past. It does not, by itself, tell us whether that hot phase was the absolute beginning of all reality. When astronomers say that the universe is expanding, they are not suggesting that galaxies are simply flying through a fixed emptiness away from a central blast. On large scales, the space between galaxies is stretching. A helpful image is a sheet of flexible material marked with many dots. As the sheet expands, every dot sees the others moving away, even though no dot is the unique center of the expansion. The analogy is imperfect because the universe does not need to be embedded in a higher dimensional room, but it captures an important idea. Expansion belongs to the geometry of space, not merely to the motion of objects within it. Reversing that expansion mathematically leads us toward a denser cosmic past. The evidence for this hot, dense past comes from several independent directions. Distant galaxies show a pattern of redshift consistent with cosmic expansion. The cosmic microwave background reveals a universe that was once filled with hot radiation. The observed abundances of hydrogen, helium, and other light nuclei match calculations of nuclear reactions during the first minutes. The growth and distribution of galaxies also fit a picture in which small early fluctuations developed through gravity. Together, these observations make the hot Big Bang model extraordinarily successful. Yet success in describing the early evolution of the universe does not mean the theory can describe the first moment, because its equations eventually reach conditions where they cease to be reliable. If we use general relativity to run the expansion backward, the average density and temperature rise. The curvature of space-time becomes increasingly extreme. Under simplified assumptions, the equations lead toward a singularity, where density and curvature become infinite and ordinary descriptions of space and time break down. It is tempting to identify this mathematical singularity with the literal creation of the universe. But a singularity often signals that a theory has been pushed beyond the range where it can be trusted. It marks a boundary of the model, not necessarily a physical object that truly existed. The equations may be telling us that new physics is required before we can continue the story. A similar limitation appears in other areas of physics. Classical equations can produce infinities when they ignore effects that become important at small scales. The old classical description of an electron orbiting an atomic nucleus, for example, could not explain stable atoms, Quantum mechanics provided a deeper framework in which the problem was reformulated. The Big Bang singularity may play a comparable role. General relativity treats space-time as smooth. But near the earliest cosmic conditions, quantum effects may make space-time fluctuate or lose its familiar continuous structure. Until gravity is described quantum mechanically, extrapolating all the way to an absolute beginning remains uncertain. This uncertainty leaves several possibilities open. Time may truly have begun with the universe, so that there was no earlier moment in any meaningful sense. The universe may instead have emerged from a prior contracting phase, passing through a quantum bounce rather than an infinite singularity. It may have originated in a timeless or nearly timeless quantum state. Our expanding region might also be one part of a larger structure whose history extends further into the past. These possibilities are not equally developed, and none has been confirmed. They are scientific proposals only when they are expressed mathematically and connected, at least in principle, to observable consequences. The idea that time itself could have a beginning is difficult because human thought is built around sequences. We naturally ask what happened before any event, but time is not merely a universal clock running outside the cosmos. In relativity, time is woven together with space, matter, motion, and gravity. If the geometry of space-time begins at a boundary, asking what happened earlier may assume a direction that does not exist. An often used analogy is the surface of Earth. You may travel north until you reach the North Pole, but asking for a point farther north on the surface is not answered by discovering hidden territory. The direction has ended, although the analogy does not prove that cosmic time behaves this way. Some quantum cosmological models attempt to describe such a boundary without a sharp beginning. In one family of ideas, the earliest universe may be represented by a geometry in which the distinction between time and space becomes blurred. Near the boundary, time could behave more like another spatial direction, removing the need for a singular first instant. The universe would be finite in its past extent, but would have no abrupt edge. Somewhat, as Earth's surface is finite without possessing a boundary. These models are mathematically intriguing, but interpreting their physical meaning is challenging. They do not yet provide an experimentally confirmed account of how our observable universe emerged. Another possibility is that the hot Big Bang followed inflation. In this view, the universe was already present in an unusual state dominated by energy associated with a field. During inflation, space expanded rapidly, smoothing curvature and diluting earlier particles. When inflation ended, the energy driving it was transformed into a hot mixture of matter and radiation, a process often called reheating. The conventional hot Big Bang evolution then began. If this picture is correct, the hot, dense state was not the first condition. It was the aftermath of an earlier transformation. Yet this merely moves the question backward. What created the inflating region? And what, if anything, preceded it? Inflationary theories come in many forms. Some begin from a particular quantum state. Others imagine inflation arising within a broader eternal process. In eternal inflation, expansion ends in some regions while continuing in others, potentially generating many separate cosmic domains with different properties. Our observable universe would occupy one such domain. This scenario is sometimes associated with the idea of a multiverse, but its interpretation and testability remain debated. Even if eternal inflation occurs toward the future, it does not automatically establish an eternal past. Certain mathematical arguments indicate that sufficiently expanding spacetimes may still require an earlier boundary or a different preceding phase. To understand why a prior phase might leave evidence, consider inflation as both a magnifier and an eraser. Quantum fluctuations present during inflation could be stretched to cosmic scales, eventually producing the patterns observed in the microwave background. At the same time, any ordinary particles or irregularities that existed before inflation might be spread so thinly that they disappear from our observable region. The outcome depends on duration. If inflation continued far longer than necessary, evidence of preceding conditions would probably be hidden beyond our horizon. If it lasted only a limited time, some of the largest observable structures might preserve a faint dependence on whatever came before. Researchers therefore examine the broadest patterns in the cosmic microwave background with special interest. These large angular scales correspond to enormous regions of the early universe. Some measurements suggest that power in the largest temperature fluctuations may be slightly lower than simple models predict. Other analyses have explored asymmetries or unusual correlations. Such features could, in certain theoretical models, reflect conditions at the beginning of inflation or a preceding cosmic phase. Yet the evidence is weak because we observe only one universe and one microwave sky. At the largest scales, there are very few independent regions to measure, producing an unavoidable statistical uncertainty known as cosmic variance. Cosmic variance is not caused by poor instruments. It is a fundamental limit arising from the fact that we possess only one observable realization of the universe. Imagine trying to determine whether a die is perfectly fair after being allowed only a few throws. Even flawless observation would leave uncertainty because the sample is small. For the largest cosmic patterns, nature has provided only a limited number of examples within our horizon. This makes it difficult to decide whether an unusual feature reflects deep physics or ordinary chance. Some questions about the earliest universe may remain ambiguous even after measurements become nearly perfect. Alternatives to inflation attempt to explain the same observations through different histories. In bouncing cosmologies, the universe existed in a contracting state before reaching an extremely dense phase. Quantum gravitational effects or unusual forms of matter might then prevent a singular collapse and produce a transition into expansion. During contraction, fluctuations could be generated and later carried through the bounce, potentially forming the seeds of galaxies. If these models are correct, the Big Bang would be a bridge between two phases rather than an absolute beginning. The challenge is to create a bounce that is mathematically stable, physically plausible, and consistent with the precision patterns observed in the sky. A contracting universe is not simply the film of our cosmos played backward. As matter collapses, small irregularities can grow, and anisotropies may become dominant. Without a mechanism to control them, the universe could approach a chaotic state rather than a smooth bounce. Some proposals introduce a period of slow contraction governed by a special field, which can suppress unwanted irregularities and produce nearly uniform conditions. Others rely on quantum geometry to limit density and replace the singularity with a finite transition. These theories continue to be studied, but their unique observational predictions are often subtle. Many can be adjusted to resemble inflation, making decisive tests difficult. Cyclic models extend the idea further. Instead of one contraction followed by one expansion, the universe may pass through repeated cosmic eras. Expansion could eventually lead to contraction, or one long phase might transform into another without a conventional collapse. The ancient light we observe today might then carry patterns inherited from a previous cycle. Yet repeated cycles face serious questions. Entropy, a measure related to the number of possible microscopic arrangements, generally increases. If entropy accumulates from cycle to cycle, each era may differ from the one before it, and tracing the sequence into an infinite past becomes problematic. Successful cyclic theories must explain how this thermodynamic history is managed. One especially unusual proposal suggests that the remote future of one universe could be mathematically connected to the Big Bang of another. In the far future, stars might burn out, black holes might eventually disappear, and the universe could become dominated by extremely dilute radiation and particles with no meaningful rest mass. Under certain geometric transformations, a vast, cold, nearly empty cosmos might be related to a small, hot beginning. In this picture, cosmic history is divided into successive eras, or aeon. Possible traces from an earlier aeon have been proposed in microwave data, but the claims remain controversial and have not gained general observational acceptance. Quantum mechanics introduces still other possibilities. The universe may not have followed one classical history before becoming large and familiar. Instead, its earliest state might be described by a quantum wave function containing many possible geometries. The classical expansion we observe could emerge when quantum alternatives became effectively distinct. In this framework, asking for one definite event before the Big Bang may be inappropriate. The beginning might be better understood as a transition from a quantum description without ordinary spacetime into a classical universe with recognizable time. Such ideas are conceptually rich, but quantum cosmology lacks the straightforward experimental access available in laboratory physics. This raises a profound problem. Quantum mechanics is usually applied to systems observed from outside, but the universe has no external laboratory observer in the usual sense. When physicists describe a particle, they can distinguish the system from the measuring apparatus. When describing the entire universe, that separation becomes difficult. Different interpretations of quantum theory may lead to different ways of understanding cosmic origins. Some approaches emphasize branching histories. Others emphasize relational quantities or the emergence of classical behavior through interactions among parts of the universe. These debates do not mean that anything is possible. They mean that the foundational language needed for the earliest cosmos is still under construction. The nature of causality may also change near the beginning. In everyday life, causes precede effects along a clear direction of time, but the arrow of time itself is linked to the universe's exceptionally low entropy early state. Why the cosmos began in such an ordered condition remains one of the deepest puzzles in physics. A previous universe might help explain that order, or it might make the problem harder by requiring special conditions in an even earlier phase. Some models attempt to produce an arrow of time pointing away from a low-entropy boundary in more than one direction. Others propose that time and thermodynamic order emerge together. No explanation has yet achieved broad confirmation. Any evidence for a universe before ours must confront this range of possibilities. A pattern in ancient light cannot be interpreted without a theory explaining how it crossed the boundary. If the earlier phase was contracting, the pattern must survive a bounce. If inflation intervened, it must avoid being diluted. If time emerged from a quantum state, the word before may need reinterpretation. If a previous aeon faded into the distant future, the proposed signal must remain meaningful through an enormous change of scale. The observational search and the theoretical framework must develop together, each constraining the other. The Big Bang, then, is both more secure and less final than its popular image suggests. The evidence strongly supports the conclusion that our observable universe evolved from a hot, dense, early state. We can describe much of that evolution with remarkable precision, but the deeper we approach the earliest boundary, the more our equations depend on untested assumptions. The Big Bang theory does not require us to claim that everything emerged from an infinitely dense point, nor does it prove that a previous universe existed. It brings us to a frontier where several possibilities remain open and where certainty gives way to disciplined curiosity. Perhaps the most restful way to imagine this frontier is not as a violent wall, but as a distant shoreline hidden by mist. Behind us lies the well-mapped cosmic landscape of atoms, stars, galaxies, and oscillant radiation. Ahead lies a region where space-time may have contracted, fluctuated, emerged, or changed its form. We cannot yet see across that mist, but our theories suggest shapes that might exist beyond it. The next step is to explore those shapes more closely, the scientific models in which one universe can precede another, and the delicate pathways through which some trace of an earlier cosmos might survive into our own. If our universe was not the first cosmic chapter, then some physical process must connect one chapter to another. The connection could be a bounce after contraction, a transition between quantum states, or a slow transformation in which the distant future of one universe becomes the beginning of the next. Each possibility changes the meaning of the phrase, a universe before ours. It may refer to an earlier phase of the same spacetime, a separate cosmic era connected through unusual geometry, or a larger structure containing many expanding regions. These models are not established facts. They are carefully constructed attempts to extend known physics beyond the boundary where the standard hot Big Bang description becomes incomplete. The most intuitive of these proposals is the bouncing universe. Imagine cosmic expansion gradually slowing, reversing, and becoming contraction. Galaxies would not necessarily fall inward toward one central point. Instead, distances throughout space would decrease. Just as they now increase, matter and radiation would grow denser and hotter as the universe contracted. Classical general relativity suggests that such contraction could end in a singularity, where the known equations fail. A bouncing model introduces new physics that prevents infinite compression. At some extremely high but finite density, the contraction stops and turns into expansion. What we call the Big Bang would then be the outward phase following this bounce. A bounce sounds simple when described in words, but producing one consistently is difficult. Under ordinary general relativity, matter with familiar properties tends to strengthen collapse rather than reverse it. Some models therefore require forms of energy with unusual pressure, modifications to Einstein's equations, or quantum effects that become important at extreme density. These ingredients must do more than create a mathematical reversal. They must avoid instabilities, preserve a universe smooth enough to resemble ours, and generate fluctuations matching the observed cosmic microwave background. A theory can produce a bounce while still failing to explain the actual universe. The challenge lies not merely in surviving contraction, but in emerging with the precise conditions needed for galaxies and cosmic structure. One approach arises from loop quantum cosmology, a simplified application of ideas from loop quantum gravity. In this framework, space may possess a discrete quantum structure at extremely small scales rather than being infinitely divisible. As density rises during contraction, quantum geometric effects can act somewhat like a repulsive contribution, preventing spacetime from reaching infinite curvature. The classical singularity is replaced by a quantum bounce. Afterward, the universe enters an expanding phase. This picture offers a mathematically defined way to continue cosmic history through what would otherwise be the Big Bang singularity. Although the full theory and its connection to observable reality remain subjects of active research. If a quantum bounce occurred, fluctuations from the contracting phase might pass through it and influence the expanding universe. Those fluctuations could later appear as variations in density and perhaps as patterns in the cosmic microwave background. The details depend strongly on how quantum geometry behaves during the transition. Different approximations can produce different predictions, and it is difficult to calculate the evolution of all relevant modes with complete confidence. Some models predict small departures from the nearly scale-invariant spectrum expected from simple inflation. Others produce features at the largest scales or distinct gravitational wave signatures. None has yet yielded evidence strong enough to demonstrate that a bounce truly occurred. Another family of models uses a period of very slow contraction before the bounce. This is often associated with an ekpyrotic phase, named after an ancient word for a cosmic fire or transformation. During slow contraction, a field with particular properties may suppress spatial curvature and large-scale anisotropy. The universe becomes smoother as it contracts, in contrast with ordinary matter-dominated contraction, which can amplify chaos. Quantum fluctuations generated during this phase may later be converted into density variations. The hot, expanding universe then emerges after a collision-like event or bounce. Such models were partly motivated by higher dimensional theories. Although versions can be studied without requiring a literal collision between physical membranes, slow contraction may solve some problems, but it introduces others. The mechanism converting contraction into expansion must remain stable, and the fluctuations must acquire the correct statistical form. Observations show that primordial fluctuations are nearly Gaussian, meaning their distribution resembles a simple bell curve with only small deviations. They are also nearly scale invariant, with similar strength across a wide range of sizes. Both inflationary and bouncing theories can sometimes reproduce these properties, making them difficult to distinguish. Researchers therefore search for subtle differences, including non-Gaussian patterns, correlations between modes, and specific gravitational wave spectra. The competition is decided not by elegance alone, but by predictions that observations can test. Cyclic cosmologies expand the bouncing idea into a repeating sequence. A universe may pass through contraction, bounce, expansion, and another contraction, continuing through multiple cycles. At first, this seems to remove the need for a beginning, because every cycle is preceded by another. Yet an eternal sequence is not automatically free of problems. Entropy tends to increase, meaning each cycle may begin with more disorder or occupy a larger volume than the one before. If the cycles grow longer and larger toward the future, tracing them indefinitely backward may lead to a finite boundary after all. A complete cyclic model must explain both the bounce and the thermodynamic evolution across many eras. Some cyclic theories avoid a conventional recollapse. Instead, accelerated expansion stretches the universe so dramatically that most matter becomes isolated in separate regions. A small, nearly empty portion might then contract and begin a new cycle with reduced entropy per observable region. This idea attempts to preserve repeated cosmic renewal without carrying every black hole, galaxy, and particle into the next phase. But dividing global entropy from the entropy inside one region raises difficult conceptual and mathematical questions. It is not enough to say that unwanted information disappears beyond a horizon. The theory must describe precisely what happens to physical degrees of freedom and how the next cycle begins under well-defined laws. A very different proposal is conformal cyclic cosmology. In this picture, the distant future of one cosmic era is connected to the Big Bang of the next, without a conventional contraction. As the universe expands for an unimaginably long time, stars fade, matter decays, if such decay is possible, and black holes may eventually evaporate through Hawking radiation. The remaining universe becomes extremely cold, dilute, and dominated by massless radiation. Massless particles do not possess an internal clock in the same way massive objects do, and the absolute scale of distance may lose some physical meaning. Through a conformal transformation, this enormous late universe can be mathematically related to a new small beginning. Under conformal cyclic cosmology, each universe-like era is called an eon. The remote future of one aeon becomes the Big Bang boundary of the next. Advocates have proposed that extremely energetic events in a previous eon could leave circular or point-like features in our cosmic microwave background. Suggested sources include collisions of supermassive black holes or the final evaporation of enormous black holes. Claims of such patterns have generated debate, but independent analyses have not established them as convincing evidence. Random fluctuations can create visually suggestive structures, and testing a pattern chosen after examining the data introduces statistical risks. The model remains speculative rather than observationally confirmed. There are also cosmologies in which our universe emerged through quantum tunneling. In quantum mechanics, a system can sometimes cross a barrier that would be impossible under classical physics. A particle, for example, may appear on the other side of an energy barrier without travelling over it in the ordinary sense. Applied to cosmology, Tunneling proposals describe the universe transitioning from one quantum configuration to another. The earlier state might be a vacuum with different properties, a compact geometry, or a region belonging to a larger inflating spacetime. The word tunneling is metaphorical when applied to the entire universe, but the underlying mathematics may resemble familiar quantum processes. In some versions of eternal inflation, space contains a background state that continues expanding while local regions stop inflating and form bubble universes. Each bubble may begin with a hot phase resembling a Big Bang. Other bubbles could possess different physical conditions, depending on the energy state into which they formed. A collision between bubbles might leave an imprint on the microwave background, perhaps as a circular temperature pattern or a specific polarization signal. Searches have been conducted for such evidence, but no accepted detection has emerged. Even if a candidate pattern appeared, researchers would need to establish that ordinary cosmological fluctuations and foreground effects could not explain it. The idea of bubble universes raises a subtle question about what counts as before. A neighbouring bubble may not precede ours in a simple temporal sequence. Both could arise from a larger, inflating background, each with its own internal cosmic history. From inside our observable region, the beginning of time may appear associated with the bubble's hot origin, while the broader spacetime extends beyond it. In that case, ancient light might reveal not an earlier version of our universe, but an interaction with another region. The observational result could resemble evidence of a previous cosmos, even though the underlying geometry is more complex than one universe replacing another. String-inspired models introduce further possibilities. In some scenarios, our familiar three-dimensional space exists on a higher dimensional object called a brane. Another brane may move nearby within a larger dimensional setting. A collision between branes could release energy and initiate a hot expanding phase. The Big Bang would then be associated with this collision rather than a singular creation event. Earlier motion in the higher dimensional space would constitute a pre-Big Bang history. Such ideas can produce cyclic behavior if collisions repeat. However, the higher dimensional dynamics must be stabilized, and the predicted perturbations must agree with observation. No direct evidence currently confirms that branes describe our universe. String theory also motivates a pre-Big Bang scenario in which the universe begins in a weakly coupled, low curvature state and evolves toward increasing curvature. A transition then connects this phase to the conventional hot expanding universe. This approach uses symmetries that relate expanding and contracting solutions. It offers a cosmic history extending before the standard Big Bang. But the transition through the highest curvature regime is difficult to calculate because the theory becomes strongly quantum mechanical. Potential signatures may appear in gravitational waves or in the statistics of primordial perturbations. Yet distinguishing them from other models remains challenging. Across all these proposals, the survival of information is the central issue. A previous universe could exist and still be completely invisible to us. If the transition strongly thermalized matter and radiation, detailed patterns would be erased. If inflation followed the transition and continued long enough, earlier structures would be stretched beyond our horizon. If quantum evolution scrambled accessible degrees of freedom, information might survive only in correlations too subtle to measure. The mere logical possibility of a prehistory does not guarantee an observable trace. Nature may preserve information globally while hiding it from every observer inside our cosmic region. To leave a visible imprint, a previous phase must influence quantities that survive into the later universe. These might include the overall curvature of space, the distribution of primordial fluctuations, the balance between matter and antimatter, the spectrum of gravitational waves, or the values of certain physical fields. Ancient light would then reveal the earlier universe indirectly. Its temperature variations and polarization would reflect the inherited initial conditions. Researchers would not be looking for a literal picture of previous galaxies. Those galaxies, if they existed at all, would almost certainly have been destroyed or transformed. The surviving evidence would be abstract, encoded in statistics rather than recognizable objects. This distinction protects the scientific question from becoming too imaginative. A model cannot simply claim that any unusual feature is a message from another universe. It must describe the transition mathematically, calculate the expected signal, and explain why that signal is unlikely under competing theories. Ideally, the prediction should appear in several independent observations. A proposed pre-Big Bang model might predict one pattern in microwave polarization, another in primordial gravitational waves, and a related effect in large-scale structure. Agreement across these channels would be far more persuasive than an isolated anomaly selected after the fact. The difficulty is that many early universe models can imitate one another. Inflation, slow contraction, quantum bounces, and other mechanisms can all be adjusted to generate nearly scale-invariant density fluctuations. Their broad predictions may converge because the observable universe preserves only limited information from extreme early conditions. This creates a kind of cosmic degeneracy, in which different histories lead to similar present-day evidence. Breaking that degeneracy requires precision measurements of subtle features such as non-Gaussianity, primordial gravitational waves, spectral distortions, and correlations across enormous scales. Even then, some models may remain observationally indistinguishable. There is also the danger of theoretical flexibility. A model with many adjustable parameters may fit almost any dataset, but this does not necessarily make it powerful. Strong scientific theories expose themselves to possible failure. They identify patterns that should appear and patterns that must not appear. If every observation can be explained after modifying the model, the theory becomes difficult to test. Cosmologists, therefore, value proposals that produce clear, restricted predictions. The question is not whether a theory can be made compatible with the sky, but whether the sky contains a feature that the theory uniquely anticipated. At present, no bouncing, cyclic, tunneling, brane, or previous eon model has received decisive observational confirmation. Inflation remains the most widely used framework for explaining the early smoothness and primordial fluctuations of the universe. Although its specific mechanism is also unknown, this may sound like a landscape of uncertainty, but it is a productive uncertainty. Each model clarifies what must be measured. Each exposes assumptions hidden inside familiar phrases such as the beginning of time. And each reminds us that the hot Big Bang is an observationally supported chapter even if the page before it remains unread. The universe before ours, if it existed, may therefore have been similar to our own, or it may have been profoundly different. It might have contained stars and black holes during an earlier expansion. It might have been a contracting field-filled cosmos without galaxies. It might have been a quantum state in which ordinary time had not yet emerged. The phrase previous universe gathers these possibilities under one poetic name. But scientifically they represent distinct structures. Their predicted traces differ, and so must the methods used to search for them. Somewhere within the ancient sky, a surviving trace might appear as a broad suppression of fluctuations, an unusual polarization pattern, a non-random correlation, or a background of gravitational waves with a distinctive shape. Yet before any such feature can become evidence, it must survive the careful work of statistics, instrument calibration, foreground removal, and independent verification. The sky is not a blank page. It is layered with radiation from our galaxy, distant galaxies, intervening matter, and the instruments themselves. A genuine primordial signal must be separated from all of them. We have now imagined the bridges that might connect one cosmic era to another. Some pass through contraction and a quantum bounce. Others link a nearly empty future to a new beginning, or place our universe inside a larger inflating structure. None has yet crossed from possibility into established history. To move closer to an answer, we must turn away from the models themselves and look directly at the evidence they seek to explain. The next part of the journey lies in the ancient microwave sky, where tiny temperature variations and delicate polarization patterns may contain either the fingerprints of a deeper past or the beautiful randomness of our own universe's beginning. If a universe before ours left any mark upon the ancient light, it would probably not resemble a recognizable picture. We would not expect to find the outline of an earlier galaxy or the shadow of a vanished star. The transition into our hot early universe would have transformed matter and radiation too completely for such detailed images to survive. Instead, the evidence would be hidden in patterns, slight differences in temperature, faint orientations of polarization, unusual correlations between distant regions, or statistical features that ordinary cosmology does not easily produce. The cosmic microwave background is therefore studied less like a photograph and more like an immense field of numbers, each point carrying a small piece of information about the universe's earliest observable conditions. The temperature map of the microwave sky contains variations of only a few 10,000ths of a degree. These tiny differences are usually shown with exaggerated colors so that human eyes can see them. A red region on such a map is not truly hot in an everyday sense, nor is a blue region deeply cold. Both are extremely close to the same average temperature. What matters is the delicate contrast between them. Those variations reveal differences in density, motion, and gravitational potential within the primordial plasma. By measuring how strong the fluctuations are at different angular sizes, cosmologists can reconstruct many properties of the early universe with extraordinary precision. One of the most useful tools for studying these patterns is called the angular power spectrum. Imagine hearing a musical note and separating it into its individual frequencies. A complex sound may contain low tones, high tones, and many harmonics mixed together. In a similar way, the microwave sky can be separated into patterns of different sizes. Some variations stretch across broad portions of the sky, while others form much smaller patches. The power spectrum measures how much variation exists at each scale. Its sequence of peaks and valleys reflects the behavior of sound waves moving through the hot early plasma before atoms formed and light began traveling freely. These primordial sound waves were not sounds moving through air. They were compressions and rarefactions in a mixture of radiation and matter. Gravity pulled denser regions inward, while the pressure of intense radiation pushed outward. This competition produced oscillations across the early universe. At recombination, the oscillations were effectively frozen into the microwave background. Some regions were caught at maximum compression, others at maximum expansion, and still others at intermediate stages. The characteristic sizes of these patterns create the acoustic peaks seen in the power spectrum. Their locations and relative heights reveal the universe's geometry, matter, content, and early expansion history. The close agreement between these measurements and the standard cosmological model is one reason extraordinary interpretations face such a high standard. A theory involving a universe before ours must preserve everything the existing model already explains. It cannot merely account for one strange feature while damaging the successful pattern of acoustic peaks. Element abundances, or galaxy formation. The new model must fit into a tightly connected web of evidence. This makes cosmology demanding but also reliable. Any genuine pre-cosmic signature would need to appear as a subtle addition to an already successful framework, rather than as a replacement chosen only because it sounds more mysterious. The largest patterns in the microwave sky are especially interesting because they correspond to the widest physical scales and potentially the earliest moments accessible to observation. If inflation lasted only a limited time, or if a pre-inflationary phase affected the beginning of expansion, those effects might appear most strongly at large angular scales. Some analyses have found that the measured strength of the broadest temperature fluctuations is slightly lower than the simplest model predicts. This has encouraged proposals involving unusual initial conditions, a cosmic bounce, or features in the inflationary process. Yet the statistical significance is modest, and cosmic variance prevents these scales from being measured with unlimited certainty. A second much discussed feature is hemispherical asymmetry. When the microwave sky is divided in certain ways, fluctuations on one broad side appear somewhat stronger than those on the other. A perfectly simple universe governed by random, statistically uniform initial fluctuations should not possess a preferred direction. However, random realizations can occasionally produce apparent imbalances, especially when researchers examine many possible divisions of the sky. Galactic foregrounds and data processing choices may also influence the result. The asymmetry remains interesting because it appears in more than one dataset, but it has not reached the level required to establish new physics or an inherited pattern from a previous cosmos. The cold spot is another famous anomaly. It is a large region in the southern celestial sky where the microwave temperature is lower than the surrounding average. The cold spot is too broad to be understood as a single empty patch in ordinary three-dimensional space. Although foreground structures between us and the last scattering surface may contribute to its appearance, some researchers have considered whether an enormous cosmic void could reduce the observed temperature through gravitational effects as photons pass through it. Others have explored more exotic ideas, including a collision between our expanding region and another bubble universe. No explanation has been confirmed, and chance remains a plausible possibility. The difficulty with the cold spot illustrates a broader lesson. Human perception is highly sensitive to shapes and contrasts. When shown a coloured map, we naturally focus on the largest unusual area and ask what caused it. But a statistically random field is expected to contain prominent hot and cold regions. The important question is not whether a feature looks strange. It is how probable that feature would be under the standard model. Using a test defined fairly and preferably before seeing the data. If researchers design the test after noticing the pattern, the apparent rarity can be exaggerated because countless other possible anomalies were never counted. This problem is sometimes called the look elsewhere effect. Suppose you enter a forest and discover that one tree has an unusual pattern in its bark. If you ask in advance how likely that exact pattern is, the answer may be very small. But if you are willing to be surprised by any unusual shape on any of thousands of trees, then finding something remarkable becomes much less surprising. The microwave sky offers many scales, directions, regions, statistical measures, and combinations to examine. Correctly estimating significance requires accounting for the many opportunities available for an anomaly to appear. Without that correction, ordinary randomness can seem like a profound cosmic message. Scientists also study alignments among the largest microwave patterns. Some low-order components appear to possess axes that are more closely aligned than expected in simple simulations. This collection of features has occasionally been given dramatic, informal names, but the underlying measurements are subtle. Possible contamination from the solar system, the Milky Way, or scanning patterns has been investigated. There is no consensus that the alignments demand new cosmology. Even when an anomaly survives repeated analysis, it may reflect an unlikely but permitted realization of random initial conditions. A low probability event is not impossible, and our universe does not have to display the most average possible sky. Polarization provides a different and potentially richer source of evidence. Light can be thought of as an electromagnetic wave, oscillating in directions perpendicular to its motion. Polarization describes the preferred orientation of those oscillations. When microwave photons scattered from electrons near the last scattering surface, local differences in radiation intensity produced polarized light. Across the sky, this polarization can be separated into two broad patterns known as E modes and B modes. E modes have been measured clearly and contain valuable information about density fluctuations and the later reionization of the universe. B modes are more elusive and could reveal additional physical processes. Primordial gravitational waves would stretch and compress space-time in a way that creates a distinctive large-scale B-mode polarization pattern. Detecting such a pattern could open a window onto extremely early cosmic history. It might support inflationary models operating at very high energies, or under some circumstances help distinguish inflation from bouncing alternatives. Yet B-modes can also arise when large-scale structure gravitationally bends the paths of microwave photons, converting some E-mode polarization into B-modes. This lensing signal has been detected. Dust grains in the Milky Way can also emit polarized microwave radiation, creating foreground patterns that may resemble the desired primordial signal. The importance of foreground dust became especially clear when an early claim of primordial B-mode detection was later understood to be strongly affected by galactic emission. The episode was not a failure of science, but an example of how science corrects itself. The initial result was tested against additional observations, and the interpretation changed when better information about dust became available. The lesson is particularly relevant to searches for a previous universe. A signal arising from the deepest imaginable past may be hidden beneath radiation produced by ordinary material within our own galaxy. Extraordinary distance does not free us from nearby complications. To separate these layers, microwave observatories measure the sky at multiple frequencies. Primordial microwave radiation follows a specific frequency spectrum, while dust, energetic electrons, and other foreground sources behave differently. By comparing channels, researchers estimate how much of each signal is present. The process is mathematically demanding because foreground properties vary across the sky. No cleaning method is perfect, and different assumptions can leave slightly different residual patterns. A credible discovery must remain visible under several independent methods and across multiple instruments. It should also appear where the theory predicts, not merely wherever the data happen to contain an unexplained irregularity. Another possible clue lies in non-Gaussianity. The simplest inflationary models predict primordial fluctuations that are very close to Gaussian random fields. In a Gaussian field, the statistical properties are largely described by the average and the two-point correlation, much as a bell-shaped distribution can be characterized by its center and width. More complex interactions in the early universe can produce additional relationships among groups of 3 or more points. These departures are called non-Gaussianity. Different mechanisms, rapid inflationary changes, multiple fields, slow contraction, cosmic defects, or bounce dynamics may generate different non-Gaussian shapes. Measurements so far show that primordial fluctuations are remarkably close to Gaussian, placing strong limits on many exotic models. This does not prove that simple inflation is correct, but it narrows the available possibilities. A bouncing universe or pre-Big Bang phase must produce fluctuations compatible with these constraints. Some versions predict non-Gaussianity too large to match observations and are therefore disfavored. Others remain viable by producing subtler signals. Future surveys of galaxies and the microwave background may measure these correlations more precisely, perhaps revealing a small departure that distinguishes one early history from another. Until then, the near-Gaussian sky remains a powerful statement about what probably did not happen. Cosmic topology offers another way ancient light might reveal deeper structure. Topology concerns the global connectedness of space rather than its local curvature. A universe can be locally flat, yet wrap around on itself, somewhat like a flat video game world in which leaving one edge returns you from the opposite side. If the observable universe were smaller than the distance light has travelled since recombination, the same region of early plasma might appear in multiple directions. This could create matching circles or repeated patterns in the cosmic microwave background. Searchers have found no convincing evidence for such repetitions at observable scales, suggesting that space is either very large or not multiply connected in a detectable way. A previous cosmic phase could also leave behind large-scale spatial curvature. If the universe emerged from a bounce or another transition without sufficient inflation, it might retain measurable positive or negative curvature. Observations indicate that the observable universe is extremely close to spatially flat. This is consistent with inflation, which tends to stretch curvature toward near flatness. But some bouncing models can also produce the same result. A future measurement of a small, definite curvature could constrain the duration and nature of early expansion. Yet even then, curvature would not uniquely identify a previous universe. It would be one clue within a larger pattern of evidence. Spectral distortions offer a less familiar but promising window. The cosmic microwave background has an almost perfect thermal spectrum, known as a blackbody spectrum. Early processes that injected or redistributed energy could produce tiny departures from this ideal shape. These distortions may reveal the dissipation of small-scale density fluctuations, decaying particles, primordial magnetic fields, or other events that occurred long before recombination. Proposed space missions could measure the microwave spectrum far more precisely than current instruments. Although spectral distortions would not directly photograph a pre-Big Bang universe, they could test early conditions on scales inaccessible through ordinary temperature maps. The distribution of galaxies may preserve additional evidence. The primordial variations seen in the microwave background later grew into a vast cosmic web of clusters, filaments, and voids. Large galaxy surveys map this structure across enormous volumes and at different stages of cosmic history. They can test whether the initial fluctuations were statistically uniform, nearly Gaussian, and consistent with the standard model. Unusual correlations at very large scales might reflect early universe physics. Although observational biases and the complex behavior of galaxies must be carefully modeled, combining galaxy maps with microwave data helps reduce uncertainty because the two records trace related physics through different methods. The abundance and arrangement of galaxy clusters also depend on the primordial fluctuation spectrum. Weak gravitational lensing, in which foreground matter subtly distorts images of more distant galaxies, provides a direct map of mass distribution, including dark matter. Measurements from several surveys sometimes show mild tensions, with parameters inferred from the microwave background, such as the degree to which matter has clumped over time. These tensions are scientifically interesting, but they do not presently indicate a previous universe. They may result from systematic effects, details of astrophysical modeling, or incomplete cosmological physics at much later times than the Big Bang. A truly persuasive signal from an earlier cosmos would ideally appear in several forms at once. Suppose a bouncing model predicted a slight suppression of the largest temperature fluctuations, a specific non-Gaussian correlation, and a gravitational wave spectrum stronger at certain frequencies. Finding all three with independent instruments would create a coherent case. Each signal would support the same physical history. By contrast, explaining every anomaly with a different speculative cause produces little confidence. Science advances most strongly when one constrained idea connects observations that initially seem separate, while also surviving opportunities to be proven wrong. Even then, researchers would ask whether another explanation could produce the same combination. The earliest universe may hide its history behind a problem known as observational degeneracy. Different physical mechanisms can lead to nearly identical statistical patterns. Inflation can be modified in many ways. Bouncing models can be tuned to mimic inflationary predictions. Foreground processes and later cosmic evolution can reshape primordial signals. The goal is therefore not merely higher precision but broader diversity of observation. Temperature, polarization, gravitational waves, neutrinos, element abundances, spectral distortions, and large-scale structure each respond differently to early physics. Together, they may reveal distinctions invisible to any single messenger. There is a quiet humility in this work. Cosmologists are trying to infer events that occurred before atoms, before light travelled freely, and perhaps before the ordinary flow of time took its familiar form. They possess only one observable universe and cannot repeat its beginning in a laboratory. Yet the sky offers natural experiments on scales no laboratory could approach. Every microwave photon and every distant galaxy has been shaped by the laws of physics across billions of years. The challenge is to extract the faint original information without mistaking noise, foregrounds, or statistical chance for a message from beyond the cosmic boundary. So far, ancient light has revealed no accepted scar from a universe before ours. Its dominant message is one of remarkable simplicity, an early cosmos that was nearly uniform, nearly flat, and seeded with tiny fluctuations that were almost Gaussian and nearly scale invariant. Within this simple pattern are a few anomalies, each intriguing but none decisive. They may be hints of deeper physics, or they may be the natural imperfections of a single random sky. The correct scientific response is neither dismissal nor belief, but patient measurement, sharper prediction, and a willingness to let the evidence remain uncertain. The microwave background may ultimately contain all the electromagnetic information the universe has allowed to survive. If no pre-cosmic signature is found there, the search need not end. Light is only one messenger, and perhaps not the oldest or most faithful one. Space-time itself may carry ripples from an era hidden behind the glowing curtain. Relic particles may still drift silently through every room. Black holes, quantum correlations, and the smallest irregularities in cosmic structure may preserve histories that photons could not. To continue the journey, we must listen beyond light and consider the deeper messengers through which the universe may remember what came before. Light has carried us almost as far into the past as electromagnetic radiation can go. The cosmic microwave background forms a luminous boundary, not because nothing existed earlier, but because the universe before it was opaque. Yet nature is not limited to light. Other messengers move through matter in different ways, responding to forces that photons cannot escape. Some may have begun their journeys when the universe was seconds old. Others could have originated during inflation, a cosmic bounce, or an unknown quantum phase. If our cosmos inherited anything from a universe before it, the clearest evidence may arrive not as an image, but as a nearly imperceptible vibration, a relic particle, or a pattern hidden within space-time itself. Gravitational waves are perhaps the most promising of these deeper messengers. According to general relativity, matter and energy curve, space-time, and rapid changes in their distribution can send ripples outward at the speed of light. These waves do not travel through space-time in the same way sound moves through air. They are changes in the geometry of space-time itself. As a gravitational wave passes, distances stretch slightly in one direction and contract in another. The effect is extraordinarily small. Yet modern detectors have measured it from collisions between black holes and neutron stars. Those discoveries prove that the universe can be heard through gravity, allowing events hidden from ordinary telescopes to reveal their motion. The gravitational waves detected so far were generated comparatively recently, long after stars and galaxies formed. But the universe may also contain a much older, diffuse background of gravitational waves produced during its earliest moments. Instead of arriving from one clear direction, this primordial background would surround us from across the sky. Its waves could have been generated by quantum fluctuations during inflation, by violent transitions between high-energy states, by networks of cosmic defects, or by a bounce connecting contraction to expansion. Because gravity interacts so weakly with matter, these waves could travel through the primordial plasma without being scattered or absorbed. They might therefore carry information from behind the electromagnetic curtain. A primordial gravitational wave background would not sound like a simple note. It would contain a spectrum of frequencies, with different wavelengths reflecting different physical scales and production mechanisms. Very long waves may have wavelengths comparable to the observable universe. Shorter waves may oscillate over years, seconds, or fractions of a second. No single instrument can measure the entire range. Cosmologists therefore use several approaches, each listening to a different part of the spectrum. Together, These methods resemble a collection of radios tuned to separate cosmic stations, searching for a signal that has been travelling since the earliest accessible age of space-time. The cosmic microwave background itself can reveal the longest primordial gravitational waves indirectly. As these waves pass through the early plasma, they would have created a curling polarization pattern known as primordial B modes. Experiments continue to search for this pattern across large regions of the sky. The task is difficult because dust within the Milky Way emits polarized radiation, and gravitational lensing creates additional B modes as matter bends microwave photons during their journey. Researchers must map several frequencies, remove galactic emission, and estimate the lensing contribution. A reliable detection would need to survive independent instruments and analysis methods. So far, no primordial B-mode signal has been confirmed. Even a confirmed B-mode detection would require careful interpretation. It might support inflation operating at a high energy scale, but different inflationary models predict different strengths. Some bouncing cosmologies can also produce gravitational waves. Although their spectra may differ, the signal would tell us that an energetic early process disturbed space-time, but identifying that process would require additional evidence. Scientists would examine the distribution of wavelengths, the statistical relationship between temperature and polarization, and possible non-Gaussian features. A single detection would open a door rather than complete the story. Behind it would lie a landscape of theories, each trying to explain why the ancient geometry vibrated in precisely that way. At much lower frequencies, pulsar timing arrays listen for gravitational waves whose cycles may last years or decades. Pulsars are rapidly rotating neutron stars that emit beams of radio waves with remarkable regularity. Some function like clocks spread throughout the galaxy. When a long gravitational wave passes between Earth and a pulsar, it slightly changes the arrival time of the pulses. By observing many pulsars, astronomers search for a correlated pattern across the sky. Evidence has emerged for a common low-frequency gravitational wave background, most likely produced by populations of orbiting supermassive black hole pairs. Determining its exact origin requires continued observation, and a primordial contribution has not been established. Future space-based detectors will search frequencies that ground observatories cannot easily reach. Instead of measuring the separation between mirrors a few kilometers apart, spacecraft may exchange lasers across millions of kilometers. This enormous scale allows them to respond to slower gravitational waves from massive black hole mergers, compact binarias, and perhaps early universe processes. Ground-based detectors, meanwhile, continue to improve their sensitivity to faster waves. A primordial background could appear in one range or stretch across many. The shape of that spectrum may help identify whether it came from inflation, a phase transition, cosmic strings, or a bounce. Each mechanism leaves a different musical texture in the gravitational universe. Phase transitions may have occurred when the young universe cooled and fundamental fields changed their states. Water freezes when temperature drops, but fields filling all of space can also undergo transitions, altering particle properties and forces. If a primordial transition was strongly violent, bubbles of a new phase might have formed, expanded, and collided. The motion of these bubbles and the turbulence they created could generate gravitational waves. Detecting such a signal would reveal physics at energies far beyond current particle accelerators. It would not necessarily prove a universe existed before ours, but it could uncover hidden chapters between the earliest boundary and the hot Big Bang evolution we understand more clearly. Some hypothetical objects known as cosmic strings could also produce ancient gravitational waves. These are not ordinary strings, but extremely thin defects that might have formed when early universe fields changed state. Long strings could stretch across cosmic distances, while loops might oscillate and radiate gravitational energy. A network of such defects would generate a characteristic background and occasional bursts. no cosmic strings have been observed, and many versions are constrained by existing data. Yet continued searches are valuable because a detection would connect cosmology with high-energy physics. In certain models, defects might survive a transition from an earlier cosmic phase, acting as relics from conditions preceding our familiar expansion. Neutrinos offer another path toward earlier times. The cosmic neutrino background should have been released when the universe was roughly 1 second old. After neutrinos stopped interacting frequently with the surrounding plasma, these particles have travelled almost freely ever since. They fill space in enormous numbers, passing through planets, buildings, and living bodies without notice. Unlike the neutrinos produced by the Sun or nuclear reactions, relic neutrinos now possess extremely low energies. Detecting them directly is one of experimental physics' most demanding goals. Their existence is strongly supported indirectly through their influence on nucleosynthesis, the microwave background, and the growth of cosmic structure, but they have not yet been individually captured as a primordial population. A direct measurement of relic neutrinos would allow us to examine conditions hundreds of thousands of years earlier than the cosmic microwave background. Their temperature and energy distribution could test whether the early universe followed the expected thermal history. Small deviations might reveal unknown particles, unusual expansion, or interactions beyond the standard model. However, even these neutrinos would come from after the deepest origin. Any neutrinos from a previous universe would likely have been transformed or diluted unless a specific model allowed them to pass through the transition. More plausibly, an earlier cosmic phase could influence the relic neutrino background indirectly, changing its distribution in a way that survives into the expanding universe. The abundance of matter over antimatter may also carry information from extremely early times. Known physical processes usually create matter and antimatter together, yet the observable universe is overwhelmingly dominated by matter. Some mechanism in the early cosmos must have produced a tiny imbalance, leaving a small excess of matter after most particles and antiparticles annihilated. This process is broadly called baryogenesis. Although its exact mechanism remains unknown, a previous cosmic phase might establish the conditions for the imbalance, or a bounce might carry an existing asymmetry forward. Any successful explanation must satisfy strict physical requirements and agree with particle experiments. The matter composing stars and bodies may therefore be a fossil of physics older than the oldest light. Primordial black holes are another possible relic, although their existence remains unconfirmed. Unlike ordinary black holes formed from dying stars, primordial black holes could have arisen from exceptionally dense regions in the early universe. Depending on their masses, some may have evaporated through Hawking radiation, while others could survive today. They have been considered as possible contributors to dark matter and as probes of early density fluctuations. If found, their mass distribution might reveal conditions on scales too small to appear directly in the microwave background. In certain bouncing or pre-Big Bang models, unusual fluctuations could enhance their formation. But detecting primordial black holes would not by itself identify the precise cosmic history that produced them. Black holes also raise questions about whether information can survive profound transformations. Classical general relativity suggests that material crossing an event horizon becomes inaccessible to outside observers. Quantum theory, however, is built around the preservation of information. The tension between these principles created the black hole information problem, which has driven important developments in quantum gravity. If physics ultimately preserves information even during black hole evaporation, perhaps cosmic transitions also retain information in subtle correlations, yet preservation in principle does not guarantee recoverability. A shattered glass preserves information in the positions and motions of its atoms, but reconstructing the original object may be practically impossible. The early universe may hide its past in a similarly scrambled form. Some theories suggest that information about a volume of space can be represented on a lower dimensional boundary. an idea known broadly as the holographic principle. This possibility emerged from studies of black holes and quantum gravity. In certain mathematical settings, a gravitational universe can be equivalent to a quantum theory defined on its boundary. Cosmologists have explored whether the beginning of our universe might also possess a holographic description. If so, the hot Big Bang could emerge from a more fundamental quantum system in which ordinary space is not basic. Evidence of a previous phase might then survive as correlations in this underlying description. Although connecting such abstract ideas to measurable patterns remains highly challenging, quantum correlations could, in principle, preserve relationships established before the classical universe emerged. Quantum entanglement links systems in ways that cannot be explained by independent local properties. Some modern research investigates whether the structure of space-time itself may be related to patterns of entanglement. If space emerges from quantum relationships, then a cosmic transition might reorganize those relationships rather than completely destroy them. The observable consequences could appear in primordial fluctuations or other statistical patterns. These ideas are far from confirmed, and they do not allow messages to be sent from a previous universe. They offer a possible mathematical language for understanding how continuity might exist, even when familiar space-time changes form. There may also be fundamental limits to how much of cosmic history any observer can recover. The observable universe is bounded by horizons created by the finite age of the cosmos and the behavior of expansion. Light and other signals from sufficiently distant regions have not had time to reach us. Accelerated expansion may permanently prevent some regions from communicating with us in the future. Inflation may have pushed pre-existing information beyond our accessible horizon. Even gravitational waves cannot reveal events whose signals never enter our region. The absence of evidence may therefore reflect not the absence of a previous universe, but a boundary imposed by causality itself. This creates a difficult philosophical and scientific distinction. A theory may describe a universe before ours while predicting that all evidence of it is erased or hidden forever. Such a theory could be mathematically consistent, but its scientific status would be limited if no observation could distinguish it from a universe without that prehistory. Science does not require every entity to be observed directly, but it does require consequences that can be tested. A previous universe becomes an empirical question only when a model connects it to measurable features in our own cosmos. Without such a connection, the idea may remain meaningful within mathematics or philosophy while lying beyond observational confirmation. Future instruments will steadily improve this search. More sensitive microwave surveys may better remove foreground dust and isolate faint polarization. Galaxy maps will cover larger volumes and measure primordial statistics with greater precision. Space-based gravitational wave observatories may open frequency ranges never explored before. Improved pulsar timing may clarify the low-frequency background. Experiments designed to detect relic neutrinos may eventually reach the required sensitivity. Measurements of the microwave spectrum could uncover tiny distortions from ancient energy release. None guarantees evidence of a universe before ours, but each expands the number of ways nature can answer. The most powerful discovery would be a consistent pattern shared across several messengers. A microwave anomaly alone can be dismissed as chance. A gravitational wave spectrum alone may fit many early processes, but suppose one model predicted a particular suppression in large-scale temperature fluctuations, a matching polarization structure, and a related gravitational wave signal. If all appeared independently, the combined evidence could become difficult to explain through coincidence. Cosmology would begin to move from speculation toward reconstruction. We might not see the earlier universe directly, but we could infer its properties in the same way scientists infer an unseen planet from the motion it causes in a visible star. It is equally possible that every improved measurement will continue to support a universe whose observable conditions were set entirely within inflation, or another early phase of our own cosmos. Ancient gravitational waves may be too faint. Relic neutrinos may confirm the standard thermal history without exposing anything earlier. Primordial black holes may not exist in detectable numbers. The microwave sky may remain consistent with random fluctuations. Such outcomes would not prove there was no previous universe. They would show that nature has preserved no accessible evidence, or that our instruments have not yet reached it. Scientific silence can narrow possibilities without offering a final metaphysical answer. We now stand at the edge of what the universe may allow us to know. Ancient light gives us a glowing surface from 380,000 years after the hot Big Bang. Element abundances reach back to the first minutes. Relic neutrinos could carry information from the first second. Primordial gravitational waves might reach still deeper, perhaps into inflation or through a cosmic bounce. Beyond them lies the uncertain realm, where space-time becomes quantum and the meaning of before begins to soften. Whether that realm contains another universe, a timeless state, or a boundary without an earlier side remains unanswered. Yet the search itself reveals something profound. The universe is not merely filled with objects, it is filled with memory. Light remembers the plasma from which it escaped. Atomic nuclei remember ancient temperatures. Galaxies remember small fluctuations in density. Space-time may remember its earliest vibrations. Even when the original events are gone, their consequences continue moving through nature, becoming quieter and more difficult to hear. In the final part of our journey, we will consider what it would mean if one of these memories truly came from a universe before ours, and what it means for humanity to listen patiently at the boundary of cosmic time, perhaps somewhere within the oldest radiation, the quietest gravitational wave, or the faintest quantum correlation. There is a trace that did not begin with our universe. It may be no more than a small departure from an otherwise simple pattern, a subtle imbalance that survives every careful test. If such a signal were confirmed, it would not resemble a doorway through which we could watch an earlier cosmos directly. It would be more like finding a weathered footprint on an ancient shore. The traveller would be gone, the landscape transformed, and the path erased by time. Yet the impression would show that the history of the shore extended beyond the horizon we once believed was the beginning. A discovery of this kind would change the meaning of the Big Bang without diminishing its importance. The hot Big Bang would remain the beginning of the observable phase in which radiation, matter, atoms, stars, and galaxies developed. Its predictions would remain among the most successful achievements of science. But it would no longer appear as an absolute first page. It might become a transition, a boundary, or the aftermath of events occurring in an earlier cosmic state. The universe's history would deepen. What once seemed like the origin of everything might instead become the earliest moment at which our present physical language can clearly describe what happened. The first task would be to determine what kind of past the signal implied. A distinctive gravitational wave spectrum might suggest a period of contraction followed by a bounce. A combination of circular microwave patterns and unusual correlations could be interpreted as evidence of an interaction between cosmic domains. A particular suppression of fluctuations might indicate that inflation began from a preceding state, rather than continuing indefinitely. Yet no signal would speak for itself. Scientists would construct competing models, calculate their predictions, and ask which explanation required the fewest unsupported assumptions. The process would likely take years, perhaps decades, because the more profound the conclusion, the more carefully every ordinary alternative must be examined. Independent confirmation would be essential. One telescope might detect a microwave feature, but another instrument would need to see it as well. Polarization data would need to support the temperature pattern. Galaxy surveys might reveal a related large-scale structure. Gravitational wave observatories could search for the spectrum predicted by the same model. Researchers using different methods would attempt to reproduce the result, while others would try to show that it came from galactic dust, calibration errors, statistical chance, or imperfect modeling. This skepticism would not oppose discovery. It would protect it. A conclusion about a universe before ours would become meaningful only after surviving the most determined efforts to explain it without invoking one. Even then, the evidence might reveal only broad properties. We might learn that a prior phase was contracting, that it contained a particular type of field, or that it ended at a finite density rather than a singularity. We would probably not recover its individual stars, worlds, or events. If an earlier cosmos resembled ours, its detailed structures would have been compressed, thermalized, stretched away, or encoded beyond practical reconstruction. Cosmology often works through averages and statistical patterns rather than biographies of individual objects. We can infer the temperature of the early plasma without knowing the path of every photon. In the same way, a previous universe might become scientifically real while remaining almost entirely anonymous. This limit can feel disappointing only if we expect the cosmos to preserve history in a human form. Nature does not store the past as a library of complete scenes. It carries consequences forward through physical states. The shape of a coastline remembers erosion without recording each wave. The rings of a tree preserve seasons without showing every cloud that crossed above it. Ancient light remembers density and motion, not the stories of particular particles. A pre-cosmic signal would likely be similar, a compressed memory expressed through geometry, probability, and energy. Its emotional power would come not from visual detail, but from the realization that our universe inherited conditions from something beyond its visible beginning. Such an inheritance would raise new questions about the laws of nature. Were the same laws present in the earlier universe? Or did they emerge during the transition into ours? Were the masses of particles and strengths of forces carried through the boundary? Or were they selected anew? If cosmic cycles exist, do physical constants remain stable from one cycle to another? A measurable prehistory might allow these questions to move from philosophy toward observation. Different models could predict whether information, symmetry, entropy, or particle properties survive. The universe before ours would then become not merely an earlier setting, but a laboratory for understanding why our own cosmos has the laws it does. The arrow of time would become especially mysterious. We experience time as moving from a remembered past toward an uncertain future. Broken objects do not spontaneously reassemble, and heat naturally spreads from warmer regions into cooler ones. This direction is linked to increasing entropy. Yet the early universe appears to have begun in an extraordinarily ordered gravitational state. Despite being hot and dense, if a previous cosmos existed, it must somehow connect to this low entropy beginning. Perhaps the transition reset certain forms of order. Perhaps entropy continued globally while becoming diluted within our observable region. Or perhaps time pointed away from a special boundary in more than one direction. Each possibility would reshape our understanding of why the past differs from the future. A cyclic universe might appear to offer endless time, with no first beginning and no final ending. But infinity does not remove every mystery. If cycles repeat, we must ask whether they are truly identical or whether each inherits accumulated changes. If entropy grows, later cycles may become larger or longer. If information survives, the cosmos may carry an ever-deepening history. If information is effectively erased, each cycle may begin with little knowledge of the one before it. An eternal sequence could therefore resemble a vast chain whose links are physically connected but unable to remember one another clearly. The ancient sky might contain only the weakest pressure from the immediately preceding link. If instead time began with our universe, then the search for an earlier cosmos may return no signal, because there was no earlier temporal region to leave one. This possibility is not less scientific simply because it resists ordinary imagination. A boundary without a before may be a natural consequence of quantum geometry. The universe could be self-contained, with time emerging smoothly from a condition that cannot be described using earlier and later. In such a model, Asking what happened before would resemble asking for a location beyond the edge of a direction that has already ended. The mystery would remain, but it would shift from what came earlier to why does time exist at all? There is another possibility. Quieter and perhaps more difficult, a previous universe existed, yet no trace can ever reach us. Inflation may have erased accessible evidence. Horizons may separate us from all surviving information. Quantum correlations may preserve history only in forms no observer can decode. If this is true, then reality would possess a past that science cannot reconstruct. Not because scientists lack patience or technology, but because the laws of nature forbid the relevant signals from arriving. This would establish an ultimate limit to cosmic archaeology. We could describe several possible histories while knowing that observation may never choose among them. Science already lives with horizons of this kind. We cannot observe regions whose light has not reached us. We cannot recover every microscopic detail of a shattered object. Quantum theory limits which properties can be known simultaneously with arbitrary precision. Black hole horizons restrict access to interior events. These boundaries do not make knowledge meaningless. They define its shape. Understanding what cannot be measured is itself a discovery about nature. If the prehistory of our universe is permanently hidden, demonstrating that hiddenness through theory and observation would still teach us something profound. The cosmos contains truths that influence reality without becoming available as records to every observer. Yet we should be careful not to use uncertainty as permission to believe any preferred story. The absence of accessible evidence cannot support one detailed scenario over another. A cosmic bounce, an eternal multiverse, a timeless quantum state, and an absolute beginning are not interchangeable, simply because all address the unknown. Each must be judged by mathematical consistency, compatibility with established observations, and the possibility of testable consequences. Scientific imagination is disciplined imagination. It moves freely enough to consider realities far beyond ordinary experience, but it remains tied to evidence, logic, and the willingness to abandon even beautiful ideas when nature does not support them. This discipline gives the search its quiet strength. Human beings evolved to notice nearby movement, changing weather, familiar faces, and dangers within the landscape. Nothing in our daily environment prepared the mind to think naturally about curved space-time, quantum origins, or radiation travelling for almost the entire age of the cosmos. Yet through instruments and mathematics, the universe has become capable of examining its own remote history. Matter formed in ancient stars assembled into living brains, and those brains built detectors sensitive enough to measure temperature differences of only a few parts in 100,000 across the microwave sky. In that sense, ancient light is not only a record arriving from the past, it is part of a connection between the early universe and conscious life. The small primordial variations preserved in the cosmic microwave background eventually grew into galaxies. Inside those galaxies, gravity gathered gas into stars. Earlier generations of stars created many of the elements later incorporated into planets and living organisms. The same pattern we study as a faint microwave fluctuation helped establish the distant conditions from which observers could one day emerge. When we examine the oldest light, the universe is looking back toward the physical beginnings of its own complexity. If that light also contains an inheritance from a previous cosmos, then our connection to the past would extend further than the age of our observable universe. The matter around us might belong to a history shaped by an earlier contraction, a former aeon, or a quantum state from which space-time emerged. We would not be separate from that history. Every atom, field, and law operating here would be part of its continuation. The phrase universe before ours might then become slightly misleading, because the earlier and later phases would belong to one deeper physical process. What appears to us as a beginning could be the transformation of something whose full identity we have not yet learned to describe. This possibility does not make human life smaller. Cosmic scale often inspires a sense of insignificance. But size and duration are not measures of meaning. We occupy a tiny region and a brief interval, yet we can ask questions extending beyond stars, galaxies, and perhaps beyond the birth of space-time as we know it. Our understanding remains incomplete. But incompleteness is not emptiness. We have already learned that the night sky contains light older than Earth, that space expands, that atoms formed from an early plasma, and that tiny quantum-like fluctuations became enormous structures. These discoveries were once beyond imagination, and now they form part of our clearest scientific picture. Future observers may know more. They may detect primordial gravitational waves and reconstruct the dynamics of inflation. They may measure relic neutrinos directly or map microwave polarization with almost perfect sensitivity. They may discover a pattern that strongly favors a bounce. Or they may find that every observation continues to support a self-contained beginning. They may develop a theory of quantum gravity that makes the earliest boundary appear simple rather than paradoxical. From our present moment, we cannot know which path will open. We can only refine the questions, improve the instruments, and remain honest about the difference between possibility and evidence. Perhaps ancient light will eventually reveal a universe before ours. Perhaps it will reveal only the earliest accessible state of this one. Perhaps the deepest lesson will be that the boundary between those descriptions is less clear than language suggests. A universe can transform so completely that calling its earlier phase another universe becomes useful, even if the underlying physical history remains continuous. Or time may emerge in such a way that continuity itself loses its ordinary meaning. At this frontier, familiar words become gentle approximations around mathematics. We are still learning to understand. Tonight, the cosmic microwave background continues to pass through Earth from every direction. Most of it moves unnoticed through the atmosphere, across empty rooms, and through the darkness between sleeping cities. Specialized instruments collect a tiny portion and turn it into measurements. Within that radiation are the compressed conditions of a universe without stars, planets, or observers. Whether anything older is hidden there remains unknown, but the light itself has already completed an extraordinary journey, carrying a message from a time when the structures around us existed only as quiet possibilities. And so the question remains open. Resting at the edge of observation, could ancient light reveal a universe before ours? The honest answer is that it might, under certain models, through indirect patterns rather than images. No accepted evidence has yet shown that it does. The silence is not a conclusion, only the present boundary of knowledge. Beyond it may lie another cosmic age, a quantum origin without ordinary time, or no earlier chapter at all. For now, we listen to the oldest light, attentive but unhurried, while the universe keeps its deepest memory softly hidden in the dark.